In the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, Los Angeles County has seen a concerning rise in food insecurity. The recession triggered by the outbreak led to widespread job losses and income reductions, impacting residents. This in turn intensified food insecurity levels and deepened existing racial and economic disparities by making it harder for many to access food. The 2020 Los Angeles County Panel on Understanding Coronavirus in America shed light on this, revealing that communities of color, people experiencing houselessness, women, low-income households, and single parents bore the brunt of this insecurity. In order to truly tackle these inequalities in food access, we must confront underlying systems that uphold these disparities, which is why I am focusing on Watts, a neighborhood nestled in southern Los Angeles, which is bordered by Lynwood, Willowbrook, Compton, and Southgate. In the small area, poverty rates soar, and is home to a significant number of public housing units, among the highest in western U.S. It's an economic desert and a place where access to healthy food is scarce, creating what many describe as a food apartheid. In the 1960s, Watts was primarily a neighborhood largely populated by African Americans. Today, it's home to a significant population of low-income Latinos and African American residents. According to Holt-Gimenez and Wang's research in Reform or Transformation, the pivotal role of food injustice in the U.S. food movement, food insecurity in the United States is characterized by a nationwide epidemic of diet-related diseases that result in an estimated $240 billion a year in health costs that fall disproportionately on low-income communities of color. In these neighborhoods, food access is often limited to cheap, high-fat, high-salt, high-calorie processed food available at gas stations, liquor stores, corner stores, and fast food outlets. Here in Watts, there are only 3 grocery stores, particularly brands such as Food for Less and the most recent addition, Smart and Final. And if we stretch to include the nearby neighborhoods of Willowbrook, that adds just one more Food for Less to the list. When we consider these areas, a clear pattern emerges, showcasing the food insecurity disproportionately impacting low-income communities of color. Grocery stores and fresh, healthy food options are scarce, while fast food spots, mini markets, convenience stores, and liquor shops seem abundant. Food insecurity can have devastating health consequences. It's linked to a rise in the intake of calorie-dense foods, like fast food, which tend to be more economical or easily available, especially in areas with few grocery stores, but an excess of fast food options. And according to the County of Los Angeles Public Health, food insecurity is a serious public health problem as food insecure individuals face barriers to consuming healthy food. And due to excess intake of calories, saturated fats, salts, and added sugars, are at an increased risk for many diet-related chronic conditions, including high blood pressure, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and many forms of cancer. In addition, when food insecurity occurs during childhood, it is associated with delayed development, inability to concentrate in school, and thus diminished academic performance, anxiety and depression, and early onset obesity. Editor Jocelyn here. You might be wondering why there's certain parts of the video that are blurred, well, specifically this part, and that is completely with intention. And I do that because I would not like to support certain brands, because at the moment we are boycotting and we are not supporting brands that fund genocide. For the purpose of this video, specifically on food apartheids, I wanted to show that these corporations or restaurants are here. They are in Watts, but I just don't support them, so I will not be showing them. And just in case if you want to hop on board with me. So restaurants that rhyme with, Burger Queen, Coffee Bucks, and McDoodles. Yeah, we do not support those companies. We do not support genocide, so free Palestine. Similarly, author Armani Stewart in their work, Poetics of Black Food Scrapes, a qualitative study exploring Black culinary epistemologies and the food practices of urban dwelling, African American women experiencing food apartheid, highlights how stark contrast in diet-related health issues among African Americans is notably evident when considering gender differences. This discrepancy underscores the specific spatialized and gendered racism experienced by African American women. On average, Black women earn approximately $5,500 less annually and face higher rates of unemployment and poverty, 24%, compared to the national average for women, 14%. Moreover, a larger percentage of Black women, 27%, serve as heads of households compared to their white counterparts, 12%, effectively supporting more dependents with fewer resources. Additionally, Black women live in neighborhoods that are more racially segregated and have lower property values than their white counterparts. These socioeconomic disparities are not unrelated to the rates in diet-related health disparities in this population. Various socio-ecological factors across different levels collaborate to craft food environments marked by unequal access to affordable fresh produce and culturally appropriate foods. This encompasses limited access to grocery stores, green spaces, gardening areas, housing, and healthcare. Consequently, the term food apartheid emerges within the food justice movement to replace the insufficient use of food desert, specifically delineating low-access food environments predominantly found in Indigenous, Black, and communities of color. While food desert acknowledges the restricted access to fresh and affordable food in certain areas, it oversimplifies the intricate nature of these landscapes. It masks the structural racialized origins of disparities in food security entrenched within historical and contemporary political, social, and economic systems. On the contrary, food apartheid accurately depicts racial inequalities in food systems by pinpointing structural causes of food injustices, transcending the sole classification of food insecurity. This concept intersects with environmental racism, which underscores the disproportionate impacts of environmental dangers, pollutions, and resource allocation on marginalized communities, often rooted in race and socioeconomic status. In many cases, communities of color or low-income neighborhoods face limited access to grocery stores offering fresh produce and healthy food options. Instead, they might be populated with fast food chains or convenience stores offering predominantly processed and unhealthy options. Therefore, as previously mentioned, this lack of access to nutritious food directly affects the health and well-being of these communities, contributing to high rates of diet-related diseases like obesity, diabetes, and heart conditions. Visible vestiges of historical injustices have not only persisted but have evolved into present-day inequalities and disparities. And in order to fully comprehend these systems, it is absolutely essential to start from the beginning. As emphasized by Armani Stewart, good health, then, is not solely based on diet, giving the overwhelming evidence that racism, gendered violence, social and economic disparities, trade regulations, lack of food sovereignty, and land and livelihood dispossession are all iterations of anti-blackness. This evidence underscores how the ascribed causal relationship between food and health is far more nuanced than we are what we eat. Freeman, in their work titled Unconstitutional Food Inequality, vividly illustrates the historical intertwining of oppression with food. Throughout history, food served as a tool of colonization and enslavement. Enslaved women were deprived of food by slave owners who then used it as a form of compensation for sexual assaults. On plantations, enslaved individuals were subjected to non-nutritious diets that resulted in numerous nutrition-related illnesses and fatalities. This deliberate dietary control aimed to weaken the spirit and control any sense of pleasure among the enslaved. Similarly, the U.S. government wielded food as a means to control indigenous peoples. By recognizing the cultural significance of traditional foods, it systematically dismantled indigenous communities' ability to sustain themselves. This involved the deliberate slaughter of bison, destruction of crops, and the forced displacement of indigenous peoples onto infertile lands, reservations, under the guise of civilizing them through agriculture. This strategy led to the widespread starvation and a legacy of inadequate food provisions, contributing significantly to higher rates of food-related diseases and deaths among indigenous communities. In both eras, deliberate food rationing and the construction of unhealthy diets by white individuals resulted in widespread illness, prompting communities of color to develop various survival foods like fried bread, fried chicken, chitlins, and more. The use of food as a tool for colonization and enslavement is evident through historical events such as the mass killings of bison by white settlers, the Spanish conquistadores burning and outlawing amaranth, and contemporary instances like the burning of olive trees by Israeli settlers, a crucial food source for Palestinians, symbolizing ancestral ties, land connection, and resistance. These examples highlight how government interference drastically altered indigenous diets from healthy and sustainable to non-nutritious and insecure within a short span. For centuries, indigenous peoples' diets were shaped by geography and natural environment. Bison, for instance, served as a primary food source for several indigenous tribes in America, while Mesoamerican and Latin American tribes relied upon the three sisters: corn, maize, squash, and beans, with the addition of potatoes. Corn in particular held spiritual significance in many tribal cultures, often central to creation stories, and revered as the people of the corn. In 1923, black farmers had become the leading demographic in Watts, showcasing exceptional skill in farming and contributing to the area's vibrancy. However, alongside this positive development, the Ku Klux Klan held significant influence in Watts, benefiting from restrictive covenants as a result of flawed public policies that barred African Americans from residing near white neighbors. This period marked the onset of environmental degradation in the area. By the 1920s, Watts faced growing political turmoil, as recall campaigns split the community, providing an opportunity for the KKK to exploit divisions and influence city governance. Within Watts, Mexican American and African American residents largely lived separately from their white neighbors. Mexican Americans who had migrated to the southeast end in the city in the early 1900s to support railway construction were confined to this area. Within Watts, Mexican American and African American residents largely lived separately from their white neighbors. Mexican Americans who had migrated to the southeast end of the city in the early 1900s to support railway construction were confined to this area. Meanwhile, African Americans entering Los Angeles through Watts resided south of 103rd Street in an area referred to as Mudtown due to its rundown homes and muddy streets. However, their incorporation into the city of Los Angeles did not enhance the lives of most Black and Latino residents. As white populations departed Watts, their living conditions continued to deteriorate. Reports from various government and private agencies between the 1930s and 1950s consistently highlighted economic and social challenges that would later contribute to the 1965 riots. Despite these warnings, urban planning efforts for Watts remained neglected until after the unrest. Progress has been sluggish ever since then, taking nearly 2 decades to build a shopping center and over 28 years to plan a proposed greenbelt near the iconic Watts Towers. Consequently, the community remains one of the most impoverished in Los Angeles County, primarily due to racial segregation, housing discrimination, and a lack of investment in these communities. Historically, the construction of railroads brought in a Mexican immigrant labor force, initially housed in boxcars, tents, and eventually in small houses known as the Latin Camp. This area evolved into La Colonia, which remains predominantly Latino. The exploitation of Mexican immigrant labor in building railways, combined with the lack of economic opportunities for African Americans, contributed significantly to poverty and inequality in Watts. Moreover, a consistent pattern of racism and police brutality targeted African American and Latino residents. For instance, in 1923, 66 Black and Latino residents from Watts' South Side called for the removal of the white police chief due to relentless harassment, yet he remained in his position. However, the most concerning factor was the presence of the KKK. Seeking to expand its influence from the predominantly white Compton, the secret organization attempted to fragment Watts' black vote and orchestrate the recall of Catholic city council members. This divisive move involved using Black and Catholic operatives to create dissent within those communities. The scheme was uncovered by the California Eagle, a newspaper serving the Black community. Although the plot failed, political discord persisted. Wary of internal conflicts and facing challenges in raising funds for necessary infrastructure improvements, Watts residents decided through an election on April 1926 to join Los Angeles, enticed by the promise of economic opportunities. In the 1930s, African Americans continued to migrate to Watts, drawn by these prospects. Residents of color were often confined to their own neighborhoods, experiencing fear of law enforcement in the southeast cities. Incidents of unjustified stops by police were not uncommon, an issue that persisted today, as recalled by Bies, a lifelong resident of Watts. The beginning of the 1940s, Watts' population was relatively evenly distributed among whites, blacks, and Latinos. However, World War II triggered rapid change, transforming it into a predominantly black community. The war led to a surge in Los Angeles' population as newcomers, particularly black migrants, attracted to war-related factory jobs, settled in Watts while white populations moved out. As both an independent city and later as part of Los Angeles, Watts grappled with poverty, deplorable living conditions, and racism, which culminated in the 6 days of upheaval in 1965. Post-riot efforts included the construction of a shopping center and housing developments in the riot-affected areas alongside an influx of Latino immigrants. Nevertheless, many in the area assert that rampant poverty is proof of minimal change in the overall quality of life for Watts residents. Historic segregation and economic disenfranchisement isolated many marginalized communities geographically from areas with better resources, contributing to this ongoing struggle. Policies like redlining, employed by financial institutions and government bodies, systemically withheld financial aid and resources from predominantly African American and Latino neighborhoods. The deliberate segregation denied access to loans and investments necessary for developing essential infrastructure, such as grocery stores and vital services. As outlined in the Vice News video, Trying to Eat Healthy in a Food Desert. The issue isn't just about a shortage of supermarkets. It's deeply rooted in structural racism. Presently, black neighborhoods have fewer supermarkets and more fast food outlets compared to white neighborhoods, a disparity that can't solely be explained by income. Segregation played a pivotal role. For years, black communities were systemically denied loans and excluded from various neighborhoods nationwide, influencing food distribution patterns. Initially, grocery stores followed affluent white populations to the suburbs, leaving urban areas undeserved. Subsequently, fast food chains once targeting wealthier, predominantly white suburbs began flocking into urban, primarily black neighborhoods, which lacked adequate food options. This physical separation restricted residents' access to quality supermarkets, compelling reliance on smaller, pricier convenience stores with limited fresh produce. David Pello's book, What is Critical Environmental Justice, further emphasizes how policy mechanisms tend to favor and support industrial agricultural systems, leading to working-class communities and communities of color bearing the brunt of hunger and malnutrition. This dominance by a handful of profit-driven corporations not only neglects communities' nutritional needs, but also endangers consumers and the environment through the use of toxic herbicides, pesticides, and fossil fuels. For example, as Timothy Watkins, president and the CEO of the Watts Labor Community Action, recounts, airplanes in Watts were unrestricted in releasing fuel, contributing to environmental concerns. Moreover, the century-old pipes in Watts are leaching lead, compounding the area's environmental challenges. Government authorities at multiple levels, the city, county, state, and federal, have issued warnings highlighting the environmental poisoning in Watts. They project a staggering 12-year reduction in the life expectancy of children in Watts compared to other regions in Los Angeles due to these environmental hazards. According to Danielle Hogue, referencing the Cal EnviroScreen data from the Office of Environmental Health Hazards Assessment, Watts ranks in the 95th percentile among California's most polluted community. Remarkably, certain areas within Watts' census tracts even fall into the 100th percentile. Hogue notes that many homes in Watts are still equipped with lead pipes, despite California outlawing these pipes in the late 1900s. Furthermore, adjacent to Jordan Downs, there was a lead smelting facility. Upon its removal, in contemporary times, a staggering reading of 22,000 parts per million of lead was recorded, while the legal limit in California stands at 80 parts per million. This level was shockingly 275 times higher than the actionable threshold. Hogue emphasizes that there's no safe amount of lead exposure for the human body. Therefore, it is important to highlight that these systemic inequalities not only created food apartheids, but also contributed significantly to broader issues of poverty, health disparities, and limited socioeconomic progress within these communities. Next chapter: Solutions, Action Plans. Research and gathered information, it's evident that community activists in Watts are actively engaged in combating the food apartheid prevalent in the area. Initiatives such as establishing food banks, revitalizing abandoned spaces into gardens, and projects like Mudtown's Farms are pivotal. Mudtown Farms specifically focuses on creating an urban agricultural park to provide locally grown produce and foster a healthier environment for residents. The success of these green spaces relies on the dedicated efforts of community members. The Watts Labor Community Action Committee, in collaboration with grassroots organizations, played a pivotal role in launching Mudtown, as highlighted by Tim and Janine Watkins from WLCAC. The core objective behind initiating Mudtown Farms was to educate residents about urban farming through training programs and courses. These offerings include subsidized apprenticeships, access to land, and tailored farm business planning. Urban farming holds a promise of individual and community economic upliftment by lowering food expenses, enhancing dietary quality, and yielding favorable returns on investment. Engaging in urban farming provides a pathway for both personal and communal economic enhancement by cutting down on food expenses, enhancing the nutritional quality of diets, and producing a good return on investments. During fall break, I ran into a social media post that talked about a silent hunger crisis occurring in California among farm worker communities. The organization that had made the post was devastated that they had to make the difficult decision of having to cancel their annual toy drive for the families of farm workers due to increased need for food amongst farm workers in California. While some Americans gather around tables for the day of mourning, or what is commonly known as Thanksgiving, the very farm workers who contribute to our meals are struggling to put food on their own tables. According to The Guardian, nearly half of the 2.5 farm laborers in the U.S. are undocumented immigrants, a figure reported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA. However, growers and labor contractors estimate that this number might actually be closer to 75%. These undocumented workers undertake strenuous agricultural jobs critical to the U.S. food system, but face difficulties in providing for their families. Even prior to the pandemic, farms ranked among the nation's most hazardous workplaces where poorly compensated workers face risks such as long hours, repetitive strain injuries, exposure to pesticides, hazardous machinery, extreme heat, and animal waste. Research conducted by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future highlights that the food insecurity, inadequate housing, language barriers, and discrimination contribute significantly to severe health challenges for farm workers. Despite laboring in the fields for years, paying taxes more than political figures and the wealthy 1%, and having American children, undocumented farm workers possess minimal labor rights, limited access to occupational health services, and live under constant deportation threat. The pandemic exacerbated hardships for immigrant families, excluding them from most government aid programs, including stimulus checks and unemployment benefit. Mario Galvan, an outreach worker aiding exploited migrants for over 2 decades, expressed, Farm workers have always been treated like second-class citizens. They are the ones who always get shafted because they have the least power. If we are going to talk about food apartheid and possible solutions to this issue, especially when many approaches often emphasize one of the solutions being teaching communities vulnerable to food apartheid to farm, it is important to acknowledge that in this conversation lies a paradox. We have people who are highly skilled and who are literally feeding and supplying Americans and the world with food. We have people who keep the U.S. food system running who do not have access to the very food they plant, nurture, and harvest, and who are disproportionately being impacted by food apartheids. Therefore, it is essential to acknowledge the dehumanization and exploitation of Black, brown, and indigenous bodies in capitalistic, imperialistic systems that contribute to the systems that perpetuate food apartheids. The reading on legal violence in the lives of immigrants brings light to the far-reaching consequences of the immigration system on both immigrants and non-immigrants in the United States. As emphasized by the authors, as long as the status quo of attrition through enforcement policies and a large undocumented population persists, it adversely affects all Americans, regardless of their immigration status. For example, Menti Baranabrego work highlights the impact of increased enforcement within workplaces, giving employers greater control over worker exploitation and mistreatment. Many workers, including immigrants and native-born individuals, may hesitate to assert their rights due to fear of retaliation. This exploitation not only harms immigrant laborers, but also affects native-born workers who contend with lower wages and unsafe working conditions. A common belief suggests that mass immigration can depress wages for low-skilled American workers. However, this perception oversimplifies the issue. Immigrants themselves are not responsible for wage depression, rather it is decisions made by profit-driven employers regarding wages and hiring that have a more direct impact on wage levels. The documentary The Immigration Paradox emphasizes anytime you've got a sector or segment of workers who don't have full citizenship rights, they are vulnerable to additional exploitation, and that's basically what's going on with immigrants. When they move into the U.S. and they take jobs in what we call the secondary sector of the economy, basically they're vulnerable because they don't have citizenship rights, and that's what allows employers to keep wages down. This historical pattern has roots in the experience of enslaved individuals who had no citizenship rights and were highly susceptible to exploitation by slave owners. Their lack of rights allowed slave owners to keep labor costs minimal and maximize their profits. Child labor serves as another illustration of labor exploitation, demonstrating how profit-driven capitalists have historically been willing to exploit vulnerable segments of the population, including children, to reduce costs and increase profitability. The enduring link between slavery, child labor, and the oppression of people of color underscores a pervasive theme of exploitation in the labor market. This historical and contemporary trend disproportionately affects marginalized and vulnerable communities, often due to their limited citizenship rights or social standing. It also underscores how the pursuit of profit, an integral aspect of capitalism, has driven employers to exploit labor, often at the expense of the well-being and rights of those subjected to such exploitation. The corporate food regime has evolved through historical processes of dispossession and exploitation of resources, labor, and capital, both domestically and internationally. Therefore, racial disadvantages structured into the food system have led to a hierarchical social structure that perpetuates disparities. Thus, in order to address food inequality, it is absolutely essential to address the role of capitalism, imperialism, racism, and go beyond individualistic approaches when looking towards actions to address food apartheid. One thing I would like to emphasize is that the insights and solutions offered in this section regarding strategies to tackle food disparities are inspired by the work of Gimenez, Holt, and Wang. Their ideas present valuable solutions to address food apartheids and systemic challenges entrenched within the food system. To begin, the authors emphasize the need for structural redistributive reforms concerning ownership and redistribution of resources like land, labor, capital, and markets. These measures aim to reverse trends of dispossession and concentration within the food system. Secondly, the authors emphasize environmental justice and food justice alliances and movements. There are disproportionate impacts of environmental hazards and pollutions on communities of color, particularly low-income communities. Environmental racism, as outlined by Dr. David Pello in What is Critical Environmental Justice, is starkly illustrated in the Watts case study. It encompasses racial discrimination ingrained in environmental policymaking, the biased enforcement of regulations and laws, the intentional selection of communities of colors as sites for toxic waste facilities, the official approval of hazardous substances in these areas, and the historical exclusion of people of color from leadership roles in ecological movements. As stressed by Pello, whenever social disparities based on race and class exist, there are corresponding environmental disparities. Marginalized groups often endure high exposure to pollution, toxins, natural disasters, and the impacts of climate change. Simultaneously, they are often sidelined from decision-making bodies that shape these outcomes. The quest for global sustainability cannot succeed without addressing the harm inflicted on vulnerable communities, emphasizing that social justice and environmental protection are deeply interconnected. Within the scope of food justice, environmental issues significantly intersect with food disparities, particularly in low-income and minority neighborhoods such as Watts. As presented by Pello, various social movements have emerged, collectively constituting what's often termed the food movement. Michael Pollan, a prominent figure in mainstream food-related media, suggests that this movement unifies in recognizing the unsustainability of prevailing food and farming practices. However, the dominant narrative within this movement predominantly emphasizes quality, environmental sustainability, and safety in food production, advocating for fresh, organic, and locally sourced food. Unfortunately, it tends to disregard the historical and present-day realities faced by low-income and marginalized communities, primarily compromising people of color. This narrative often revolves around the choices made by white, middle-class consumers and their capacity to influence the food system through their purchasing power, sidelining the contributions historically marginalized communities have made to instigate change. Beneath the surface of this prevailing narrative, less celebrated movements such as community food security, food justice, and food sovereignty have also been expanding. These movements not only highlight the necessity for improved food quality, but also concentrate on addressing issues like food accessibility, social and distributional disparities, institutional racism, classism, labor rights, gender inequalities, and human rights within the food system. Stemming from movements seeking environmental justice and aiming to rectify racial imbalances in the food system, food justice endeavors to challenge institutional racism and foster social fairness within the food system. Advocates for food justice spotlight structural inequalities, systemic violence, and racism within the food system. They spotlight issues like control over food production, racialized landscapes, and wealth redistribution via community ownership. Food justice places a premium on community-driven solutions, aiming to empower and equip these communities to tackle inequalities. In its radical expressions, food justice pursues economic democracy in undeserved areas and advocating for the transfer of ownership, property, and leadership to those most affected by the industrial food system. Gimenez, Holt, and Wang emphasize how, in its most radical expressions, food justice champions economic empowerment for undeserved communities of color. This includes the transfer of ownership, property, and leadership to those most adversely affected by the industrial food system. The radical origins of food justice resonate with community efforts of the Black Panther Party from almost 50 years ago. According to Bobby Seale, co-founder of the Black Panthers, the party's enduring impact lies in grassroots initiatives like the Free Breakfast for Children's program. This program expanded to involve 49 Black Panther chapters nationwide, along with numerous other organizations collectively providing breakfast to 250,000 kids 5 days a week before school, achieved through self-initiated efforts and donations without reliance on government funding or resources from poverty alleviation programs like the War on Poverty. Before community organizing became reliant on financial support from philanthropic foundations, the Black Panthers had already achieved significant milestones. Their free breakfast program preceded the nation's schools breakfast legislation of 1973. Food provision was integral to a broader initiative aimed at Black liberation and community autonomy, evident in the Black Panther platform and program of October 1966. The first point in the program demanded freedom and the power for the Black community to determine its own destiny. As expressed in Pella's work, the platform was radical not only because it addressed the egregious manifestations of racism, such as underemployment, economic exploitation, police brutality, and a skewed criminal justice system, and suggested Black communities might secede from the United States, but because the Black Panthers sought to dismantle the capitalistic structures of racism. The call among many of today's food justice activists for local control over food and dismantling racism in the food system echoes some of the liberation politics of the Black Panthers. Less common today are the structural critiques of capitalism and racism that were integral to the Black Panthers' political work. Gimenez, Holt, and Wang highlight food sovereignty as an additional radical movement aiming to transform the food system. It revolves around the idea of entitlement and the redistribution of resources related to food production. This movement's discourse is shaped by a more radical interpretation of food justice, viewing access to land and water as fundamental human rights. It strives for the democratization of the food system, particularly advocating for the marginalized and disadvantaged, while aiming to dismantle the existing global food system. The movement for food sovereignty aims to dismantle the dominance of global markets and corporate monopolies operating at local, national, and international levels. It advocates for the redistribution and safeguarding of essential assets in food production, including seeds, water, land, processing, and distribution facilities. This movement prioritizes the rights of laborers and immigrants, a cause actively supported by organizations like the National Food Chain Workers Alliance and the Community to Community Alliance in Washington state. Gimenez, Holt, and Wang underscore how low-income communities of color often find themselves drawn towards solutions provided by mainstream food security and anti-hunger groups, as well as affordable but low-quality food from retail chains like Walmart, Food for Less, and dollar stores. This creates a conflict between groups advocating for access to any food, even if of poor quality, versus those striving for more fundamental changes within the food system. Former prioritize affordable access over no access to food, whereas the latter distrust large agri-food corporations due to their negative health impacts and economic drain on undeserved communities. To navigate this challenge, Gimenez, Holt, and Wang suggest creating a regime movement framework, considering the historical inclinations of capitalist food systems. This framework stresses the strategic significance of building alliances to address the conflict between systemic exploitation and disparities within the food system. The corporate food regime operates as part of the broader capitalist system, effectively generating wealth through market expansion, economic growth, technological advancements, and financial speculation. Aligned with late capitalist norms and practices, this regime's roots stretch back over 2 centuries, marked by extensive global disposition and accumulation. A substantial portion of this historical progression unfolded in North America, relying on the appropriation and exploitation of land, labor, and capital, both domestically and internationally. As outlined by Gimenez, Holt, and Wang, despite extensive appeals for reform during global food crisis, the actual commitment to addressing these issues remains minimal. Promised aid to end crisis often does not materialize, and governmental, multilateral solutions often reinforce the same policies that caused the crisis. Promised assistance to mitigate crisis frequently fails to materialize, and governmental as well as multilateral solutions often perpetuate the very policies that triggered these crises. These remedies support the expansion of open markets, the privatization of shared resources, the adoption of proprietary technological fixes such as genetically modified seeds, and the preservation of monopoly concentrations. Viable safety nets like food aid programs endeavor to alleviate the side effects on community food systems, but these endeavors lack efficiency without strong pressure from civil society. The author suggests that unless there is substantial pressure from civil society, reformers are unlikely to substantially alter, let alone reverse, the current neoliberal trajectory of the corporate food regime. Despite widespread acknowledgement of the necessity for reform, neoliberal policies persist in shaping global food systems. Although moderate changes like enhancing food stamps or relocating grocery stores aid vulnerable communities in managing crisis, they fall short in tackling the fundamental power imbalances within the food system. Fixing the dysfunctional food system requires a profound transformation regime change that involves structural and redistributive reforms in property, labor, capital, and markets, challenging the capitalist structures of the food system. Substantive changes in the corporate food regime are unlikely to originate solely within the system in itself. Instead, they would emerge from intense social pressure combined with political will. Gimenez, Holt, and Wang stress that the food movement, including food sovereignty and food justice groups, hold a radical critique of the corporate food regime and advocates for significant structural changes. Structural alliances with organizations working on food sovereignty and radical trends within the food movement are crucial. These alliances could address the systemic inequalities within the food value chain and challenge the corporate food regime's structural biases. Though food justice activism might not single-handedly resolve broader socioeconomic issues, it plays a crucial role in addressing racial identity and activism. When synchronized with other radical social movements, activism within the food justice sphere has the potential to confront structural inequalities present in the corporate food regime. Resolving the food crisis necessitates dismantling both racism and classism within the food system, advocating for comprehensive, redistributive reforms. The pivotal role of the food justice movement involves not only advocating fair practices on the ground, but also advocating politically for substantial transformations.